All right, let's dive into something pretty fascinating. Ireland's secret history. We're about to peel back the curtain on decades of government secrets, all thanks to something called the 30-year files.
I mean, just think about that for a second. What would you find? What kind of deals, what dramas, what quiet warnings would be hidden away in those pages? Well, here's the thing. In Ireland, that's not just some hypothetical question. It's actually real.
So, how exactly does a country's secret diary get unlocked? Well, it all comes down to this really fascinating process that's managed by the National Archives. It's all because of something called the 30-year rule. The basic idea is that after being locked away for 3 decades, all these confidential state papers, we're talking memos, secret plans, diplomatic telegrams, the works, they're finally made public. It's our chance to see what was really going on behind closed doors. Now, of course, there are a few rules to this whole thing. This standard is 30 years, but some documents, especially those related to Anglo-Irish affairs, get a much faster 10-year release. But not everything sees the light of day. Files can be held back for national security, or if they're tied to an ongoing criminal case. And here's where it gets really interesting. There's this unofficial royal rule, which is basically a principle that records about the royal family can be kept secret indefinitely. You're going to want to remember that one. It'll come up again later.
Okay, so with the rules out of the way, let's get to the good stuff. What secrets had these files actually spilled? What was the government talking about in private that they really didn't want the public to know? Let's start with a real bombshell from the 1970s. Right at the height of the Troubles, it turns out the Irish government was secretly exploring this incredibly radical, almost unthinkable plan for Northern Ireland. They actually looked into turning the entire region into a United Nations trusteeship. This would have meant the UN stepping in to run the place for maybe 10 years, complete with its own peacekeeping force. It was a contingency plan, just in case British security forces ever pulled out. And this wasn't just some casual chat. It was a formal study. Now get this for secrecy. It was so sensitive, they didn't even tell their own diplomats at the UN that they were thinking about it. Wow.
All right, let's jump forward in time to 1995. This was a really pivotal year in the peace process. And these files, they give us a front row seat to some incredible diplomatic drama between Dublin, London, and Washington. So when President Bill Clinton made his historic visit, the optics were everything. I mean, his team was absolutely obsessed with avoiding a photograph of him shaking hands with the Sinn Féin leader, Gerry Adams. But at the same time, they were pushing hard to play up Clinton's supposed Irish roots in County Fermanagh, even though their own genealogy experts privately admitted the claim was, and I'm quoting here, largely on fantasy. You can tell the relationship was definitely warming up, but it still had these really tense moments. In one meeting, after a pretty heated exchange with an Irish minister named Padraig Flynn, the British Prime Minister John Major just dryly joked that the experience was quite like the House of Commons. You can just feel the tension and the dark humor in that room, can't you? And the drama wasn't just political. No, no. The files show how a very public, very messy royal divorce spilled right over into international diplomacy. In that very same year, 1995, the then Prince Charles made the first official visit to the Republic by a British royal since independence. His team saw it as this huge PR opportunity, a way to help rehabilitate his public image. But behind the scenes, a totally different rivalry was playing out. The files reveal that Princess Diana's staff were actively looking for ways to upstage his big visit. It was a global PR war fought through diplomatic channels. Okay, but what's really powerful about these files, what makes them so important, is how they connect the past to right now. They show us that some of our biggest modern crises, they didn't just appear out of thin air. The warnings were there, decades ago. Just take this cervical check scandal, which absolutely erupted in 2018, a true national tragedy involving testing failures and just devastating delays. Well, the files reveal something pretty startling. A confidential government briefing note from all the way back in 1986, 32 years earlier, highlighted the exact same problems, major concerns over lab delays and the high cost of smear testing. So the crucial point here is this. The core problems that caused so much pain and suffering in 2018 were known, they were documented, and they were discussed at the highest levels of government more than 3 decades before. The warning was literally sitting there in a file, but it was ignored. And this whole theme of long-term secrecy, it just comes up again and again.
Here's another story. This one goes all the way back to the abdication of King Edward VIII in 1936. Remember that royal rule we talked about? Well, the files show the British government formally asking Ireland to hold back the abdication documents for an extra 32 years, just so they could, quote, march in step on keeping royal matters private. But here's the twist. Ireland's leader at the time, Amon de Valera, he took it a step further. He kept many of the most sensitive telegrams in his personal papers for over 30 years, only handing them over to the state archives in 1965. So, what's the big takeaway from all this? Beyond all the fascinating stories and the drama, there's a much deeper lesson here about how we solve problems. It's really about playing the long game. And it all kind of comes down to this really simple but powerful analogy. You just can't put a fresh coat of paint on a building with leaky pipes. I mean, sure, the fresh paint might look good for a little while, but eventually the water damage is always going to show through. And this really breaks down two very different ways to tackle any problem. You've got the quick fix, that's the fresh coat of paint, or, the New Year's resolution that's totally forgotten by February. But then you have the long game, and that's about reading the original blueprints, it's about understanding the structural history, and actually getting in there and fixing the internal pipes. And that is what these 30-year files let us do. They are the original blueprints of the state. They show us that today's crises, whether they're in healthcare or in politics, they so often come from these old bottlenecks, from leaky pipes that have just been festering for decades. And we can't find a real solution until we understand that history. And that really just leaves us with a final thought. These files are about a nation's history, for sure, but the lesson is pretty universal. So what original blueprints in your own world, maybe in your work, your community, or your life, might need a closer look? What leaky pipes have been ignored for just a little too long?